The September air over Wisconsin carried a sharp chill that year. In 1944, the war still raged across the Pacific. And yet, deep in the heart of America, a peculiar scene was unfolding. At Camp McCoy, rows of Japanese prisoners of war, their uniforms patched and worn, were ordered into formation. Instead of being marched toward fields or workshops, they were guided toward a low wooden building with blackout curtains nailed over the windows. Inside, benches faced a makeshift screen little more than a white sheet stretched tightly across a wall. The prisoners whispered nervously, unsure whether this was some kind of interrogation or a cruel joke. Then the hum of a projector filled the silence, and with a flicker of light, Hollywood appeared before their eyes. It was September 19th, 1944, a date noted in the camp records, when the first film was shown to Japanese POWs in Wisconsin, for men who had last seen Tokyo newsreels filled with heroic charges and sacred duty. The sudden burst of American jazz, neon signs, and smiling faces was disorienting. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, once a proud artillery officer, later scribbled in his confiscated diary, "The women's dresses looked unreal. Their laughter sounded foreign." And yet, part of me wanted to believe such a world existed. His words reveal the shock of men trained to despise everything American suddenly seduced by its moving images. For the guards, the experiment was as deliberate as it was symbolic. They knew America's factories were producing a B-29 bomber every day and Liberty ships faster than Japan could sink them. But raw statistics meant little to men hardened by ideology. Cinema, however, had the power to bypass defenses, and so, under the hum of the projector, in the darkness of a converted mess hall, the first seeds of doubt were planted. Some prisoners clenched their fists to resist. Others leaned forward, transfixed, as though the light itself held answers to questions they dared not voice. The contradiction was stark. Men who had fought ferociously at Guadalcanal and Saipan now sat silently before shadows on a screen. Could victory and defeat be measured not only in weapons and bodies, but in the ability to project an image of a different kind of life? It was a question that lingered in the hall long after the film ended, when the sheet fell back into lifeless white cloth. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now as this story reaches you? The projector whirred again days later, and this time the film chosen was not a patriotic war reel, but a lighthearted Hollywood musical. The year was still 1944, but the mood inside the camp shifted. The first screening had left the men unsettled, but now curiosity outweighed suspicion. The benches filled quickly, Japanese POWs sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence as the opening credits danced across the sheet, for the first time in years. Many of these men saw colors, even though the print was black and white. The brightness of the cityscapes and the sheer energy of American performance made it feel dazzling. A soldier raised on the muted tones of the battlefield dust now watched tap shoes sparkle under stage lights. The shock came not only from the imagery, but from the freedom it suggested. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe, once stationed in the Philippines, later recalled in a letter intercepted by censors, "It was strange to hear laughter that did not sound like mockery. The men and women in that world seemed untouched by war. For a moment, I forgot I was a prisoner." His words reflected what many dared not admit openly, that the allure of ordinary joy could be more powerful than the stern discipline of military codes. For guards and chaplains, these reactions were carefully observed. One officer, Lieutenant James Parker, jotted in his own logbook, "They are more silent when the women appear than when the guns do. It is as if they are not soldiers at all, but simply men denied life." Behind the experiment was a strategy to reveal America not just as an enemy, but as a nation overflowing with abundance and entertainment. It was psychological contrast between the scarcity that had defined Japanese wartime existence and the spectacle of carefree singing on an American stage. Statistics underscored the contrast. By mid-1944, Hollywood was producing over 400 feature films a year, while Japan, strained by war, managed fewer than 50. Each reel that flickered before the POWs was a reminder of a cultural machine running at full strength, even while its soldiers fought across two oceans. For men used to hardship, the sheer scale of America's output was as humbling as any battlefield loss. A whisper spread in the barracks afterward. Some men imitated dance steps awkwardly on wooden floors, others scoffed, claiming the films were lies meant to deceive. Yet even those who mocked could not erase the images that lingered in their minds. The screen had opened a window they could not close again. As night fell over Camp McCoy, a strange contradiction settled in the air. Prisoners who had once marched under the rising sun now lay awake, haunted by the sound of American jazz drifting through memory. Darkness wrapped itself around the barracks, and yet the glow of memory kept the men awake. The screenings were becoming routine, but the reactions were far from uniform for some Japanese POWs. The movies were a guilty pleasure and escape from the monotony of camp life. For others, they were a torment, a reminder that their world was collapsing while another flourished. The mess hall, transformed into a theater, became a battleground of whispers and clashing loyalties. One evening, the chosen film was a drama about American family life. A scene of a father returning home to his children stirred unexpected silence among the prisoners. Corporal Masao Ishikawa, who had not seen his own son since 1941, stared fixedly at the screen. His jaw clenched so tightly that his bunkmate later found bite marks on his lips. Afterward, Ishikawa muttered, "They are showing us what we cannot have. That is worse than hunger." His words spread through the barracks like contraband, a reminder that images could wound as deeply as bullets. Others reacted differently. A young prisoner named Taro Fujimoto smuggled a small scrap of paper and drew sketches of the American cars he saw on screen, vehicles larger and more polished than any he had seen in Japan. When discovered by fellow inmates, he was mocked for being enchanted by enemy lies. Yet within days, more men crowded around his sketches, debating the size of the engines, marveling at chrome details that seemed absurd in a world of ration cards and wooden sandals. A gossip grew. Some men claimed the cars must be fake, for no country could waste so much metal during wartime. And still, the images remained. The guards, though careful not to interfere, noticed the divided responses. Chaplains whispered that the screenings were having the intended effect, planting confusion where once there had been certainty. But confusion was dangerous, too. Tension built inside the barracks, where heated arguments erupted over whether to embrace or reject what they had seen. One night, two men nearly came to blows over a single line in a film, a character declaring, "Every man has a right to choose his own path," for soldiers raised on absolute obedience. The phrase was both intoxicating and poisonous. Outside the barracks, the American night went on factory whistles in the distance, trains carrying steel and grain across a continent untouched by bombing. Inside, men wrestled with shadows that no guard could control. They had faced American guns and tanks, but this was different. This was America in song, in laughter, in the tender clasp of a child's hand on a father's sleeve. The contradiction tore at them, sworn enemies who could not stop watching. The projector had done what propaganda leaflets never could. It had forced the prisoners to question whether their world was the only one possible. Behind the sheet of flickering light was an entire strategy, carefully measured and quietly executed. The Americans did not stumble into these screenings by chance. Military officials, chaplains, and psychologists debated the best ways to weaken hardened ideology without breaking the Geneva Convention. They knew that guns could shatter bodies, but films could reach places no rifle could touch. By the winter of 1944, camp theaters had become laboratories of persuasion, their reels chosen as deliberately as rations or work assignments. At Camp McCoy, and later at Camp Clarinda in Iowa, guards paired screenings with numbers meant to humble during a break between films. An officer casually mentioned that U.S. shipyards had launched 18 aircraft carriers in a single year, for men who had watched Japan struggle to replace even a handful of carriers after Midway. The statistics struck like a physical blow. Another time, a chaplain announced that Hollywood employed over 40,000 workers, more than the population of some Japanese industrial towns. The implication was clear: America's war machine was not only military, it was cultural, vast and inexhaustible. But the power of cinema lay not only in numbers, it was in the way the reels juxtaposed laughter with logistics. While Liberty ships slid down American docks every few days, on screen, Fred Astaire tapped his shoes against polished floors. while Detroit produced 8 million vehicles during the war. Japanese POWs watched stories of young couples driving across endless highways. The statistics and the images formed a double assault fact and fantasy, merging into one unassailable reality. For the guards, there was another layer of irony. Many of them were young Americans who had never set foot in a theater this makeshift, sitting on folding chairs beside men they had once fought in the jungles of Guadalcanal. One officer later recalled how strange it felt to laugh at a comedy knowing the man chuckling beside him had carried a bayonet just months before. Yet the screenings blurred these boundaries. In the darkness, enemies became simply men, lit by the same reel of light. Not all responded passively. A small group of die-hard loyalists staged whispered protests, insisting the films were lies meant to corrupt their spirit. They urged fellow prisoners to shut their eyes during screenings, to resist the weapon of fantasy. But even among them, cracks appeared. One man, Sergeant Tanaka, who had once scorned American decadence, was later overheard humming a tune from a Shirley Temple film while chopping wood. Gossip spread faster than orders, eroding the silence of resistance. By early 1945, the screenings were no longer novelties, but rituals. Each film carried its own lesson, each statistic its own sting. America's might was not only seen in factories and ships, but in the glow of projectors across prison camps, and for the Japanese prisoners. The realization grew heavier. Perhaps defeat was not merely imminent, but already complete. Written not just in battlefields, but in the very images now filling their nights. By the spring of 1945, the barracks were alive with chatter that had little to do with battles or military codes. Instead, gossip swirled about Hollywood stars, plots of films, and even arguments over which actress was more beautiful. For men who had once spoken only of strategy or survival, it was a startling transformation. Prisoners who had never set foot outside Asia now debated the glamour of Rita Hayworth or the charm of Judy Garland. At times, the discussions grew heated, ending in laughter or silence, as though the men themselves could not believe what they had become. One diary entry captured the shift with painful honesty. Corporal Masao Ishikawa, who had once cursed the decadent enemy, now confessed in a smuggled note, "I remember the curve of her smile more clearly than I remember the face of my own commander." His words revealed the unsettling truth. The images of Hollywood were beginning to overwrite the memories of war. Some prisoners took to sketching actresses in secret, while others tried to mimic dance steps on the dusty wooden floors of the barracks. Even those who mocked the films could not avoid absorbing them. The projector had seeped into their imaginations. Meanwhile, arguments flared in one corner. Diehards ridiculed those who admired American films, calling them traitors to the emperor. In another, men defended themselves by claiming they were only curious, not corrupted, but the laughter, the sketches, and the whispered names of Hollywood stars betrayed something deeper: desire, longing, and perhaps even admiration for the enemy's world. The films had awakened parts of their humanity that the war had buried under discipline and fear. The Americans noticed, too. A guard recalled how, after one screening, a group of prisoners stayed seated long after the reel had ended, as though unwilling to return to reality. They lingered in silence, staring at the blank white sheet, hoping for another flicker of light. To the guards, this was proof of cinema's quiet power. To the prisoners, it was a wound they could not close. And now, a question for you. The audience, if you were in their position, torn between loyalty to your homeland and the allure of a new, brighter world, how would you react? Would you shut your eyes to resist, or let the light of the screen pull you in? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective helps keep this history alive. As the war neared its end in the summer of 1945, the screenings took on a sharper edge. The news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not yet reached the camps, but the prisoners sensed a tide turning. Each reel they watched seemed less like entertainment and more like prophecy. Films about American families celebrating holidays, about men and women reunited after long separations, carried an unspoken message. This was the life awaiting America after victory for Japanese POWs. The question loomed like a shadow what awaited them when they returned to a homeland scarred by firebombs and shortages. Statistics sharpened the contrast. In July 1945, U.S. steel production reached over 80 million tons annually, while Japan's dwindled to under 7 million, automobiles, refrigerators, radios, all symbols of modernity, continued rolling off American assembly lines. Even as Japan struggled to feed its civilians, each fact, when paired with the shimmering images of Hollywood, painted a future that seemed unreachable. The prisoners could not help but compare was the emperor's promised glory any match for this abundance. Human moments revealed the cracks in their loyalty. A young soldier named Kiyoshi Matsuda, once fierce in his devotion, whispered to a bunkmate after watching a film about an American wedding, "Perhaps we were fighting for the wrong future." His words were met with silence, but no one contradicted him. Another prisoner. Sergeant Tanaka, the same man once caught humming Shirley Temple's tune, now carefully kept a folded scrap of paper with the title of a film written on it, as if preserving a talisman from a forbidden world. For the guards, these changes were undeniable. They saw how prisoners no longer sat rigidly during roll call, how conversations in Japanese grew softer, filled less with defiance and more with curiosity. The projector had not broken their will, but it had shifted their vision. They were no longer soldiers dreaming of glory, but men weighing the possibility of life beyond ideology. And now, I turn to you, watching this in your own time and place. Imagine being confronted with a vision of a world utterly different from the one you were raised to believe. Would you cling to what you were taught, or allow yourself to be changed by what you saw? Leave your reflections in the comments, because history is not only about them, but about us, too. The final reel rolled in late August 1945, days after Japan's surrender had been announced, in Camp McCoy and other camps across the Midwest. Japanese POWs gathered in silence, not knowing whether they would soon be sent home or kept in limbo. The projector whirred one last time, casting its pale beam across the sheet. This time, the film was neither a comedy nor a musical. It was newsreel footage, American soldiers liberating European cities, crowds cheering in Paris, and factories roaring with production even as victory was secured. The room was still, every prisoner straining to absorb the images. For many, it was the most painful screening of all. They had seen America's wealth and entertainment, but now they saw its triumph. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, who had once written about the strangeness of laughter, later recorded, "The streets of Europe looked brighter than the streets of Tokyo had ever been." His words revealed the depth of the contrast. Not only had Japan lost militarily, it had lost in imagination, in its ability to offer a future as vivid as the one shining from the reel. Some prisoners turned away, unable to watch, but most remained seated until the end. A few even bowed their heads not to the emperor, but in resignation to reality. Private Watanabe, who once spoke of forgetting he was a prisoner, muttered quietly, "The world is larger than what we were told." No one answered him, but no one mocked him either. Silence was the only response. The silence of men who knew that the images on screen were now their destiny. Outside, the camp carried on guards patrolling, kitchens clattering, trains whistling in the distance. But inside, as the reel sputtered and went dark, a symbolic moment lingered. The sheet fell still, blank and lifeless. Yet in the prisoners' minds, the glow remained. They had entered the hall as soldiers of a defeated empire. They left as men who had glimpsed a world beyond its reach. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it universal, but it had begun. The cinema, a weapon of light, had etched its mark deeper than any rifle could. The benches creaked as the men rose, shuffling back to their barracks under the fading summer sky. Some carried fragments of dialogue, others clung to memories of faces they would never meet, and in that twilight, the projector stood silent, its lens still warm, like an eye that had already seen too much. The war ended, yet its echoes continued in the minds of those who had lived through its contradictions. For the Japanese prisoners who sat in darkened halls in America, the memory of flickering reels remained long after they were shipped back across the Pacific. Some returned to homes reduced to ashes, others to families who could scarcely believe they had survived. And yet, tucked within their memories was something unexpected. The glow of Hollywood films, images of laughter and abundance that had unsettled and reshaped their view of the world. History records battles with precision, casualties counted, tonnage measured, treaties signed, but it often overlooks the quieter victories, the ones carried not in weapons, but in symbols. A bar of soap offered at a work detail, a guard's casual kindness, A reel of celluloid spinning in a camp mess hall, these, too, left marks that endured. The cinema had been intended as a subtle tool of re-education, but in truth, it became something more, a mirror, showing prisoners not only America's power, but the fragility of the myths they had once believed unshakable. One old soldier, decades later, confessed that he still dreamed not of battlefields, but of the sound of a projector whirring to life, the sudden hush before the first flicker of light. That memory haunted him more deeply than the crack of rifles. It was the sound of a world shifting beneath his feet, a sound that told him his empire had crumbled not only in fire, but in imagination. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Wars are not won solely by force of arms. They are also won in the quiet spaces where men confront new ideas, where the glow of a film reel proves stronger than years of discipline. And as we reflect on these forgotten screenings, we are left with an image, a blank white sheet, hanging still in the silence, yet holding within it the power to change the way men see the world,